years, the Kremlin treated its interior as untouchable, a world where command centers were safe, factories were distant from danger, and war never crossed the mountains into Chechnya. That illusion collapsed on the morning of November 27, 2025. Just 24 hours after Moscow walked away from the feast table, the war answered in kind. A sudden flash tore through the sky over SeverAkhmat headquarters. Inside, officers on a routine night shift froze as their monitors flared white and the building shuddered under a rolling shockwave. Russia said, "No peace." Ukraine replied, "Then, no safety." For 2 decades, the Kremlin called Chechnya an untouchable fortress. Ukraine proved it was simply another target. In the hours leading up to the blast, Chechnya's defenses looked solid on paper. Pantsir batteries ringed the perimeter. Tor systems covered the urban belt. Mobile EW trucks swept the airwaves in overlapping arcs. To Moscow, it was the kind of layered shield that guaranteed distance. Ukraine could hit Crimea, maybe Belgrade, but Grozny was supposed to be beyond reach. But the reality inside the system told a different story. At 2 a.m., Russian operators in Grozny's Baksangurov district were already stretched thin. Surveillance logs showed reduced manning on the night shift, part of a routine rotation after an overnight alert. The EW net was active, but it wasn't tight. Gaps appeared as units repositioned to check false radar pings, triggered by weather fronts rolling in from the mountains. That's where the pain truly began. Ukraine's intelligence services, CHR and SBU working in tandem, had mapped those weaknesses for weeks. Human sources inside Rosgvardia flagged the shift change. Signals teams intercepted the low-discipline chatter on local channels. And satellite cues confirmed what Ukraine needed to know. Chechnya's fortress was running on assumptions, not readiness. What Moscow thought was a hardened shield was, in practice, a moving target with uneven coverage. A system that worked perfectly at briefing tables, but not in real time, under real pressure. And Ukraine was watching all of it. The illusion of safety was already cracking long before the first drone appeared on the horizon. Ukraine's operation in Chechnya did not rely on luck. It relied on a structured, 3-layer plan, designed to overload the defenses around Grozny and Shali. The first layer was saturation. Dozens of low-cost decoy drones were pushed in from Dagestan, flying higher and louder than the real strike platforms. Their job wasn't to break through. It was to force Chechnya's Pantsir and Tor crews to spend time, attention, and missiles on targets that didn't matter. For nearly 40 minutes, operators reported multiple inbound tracks, as interceptors were launched at shapes that vanished the moment radar locked on. The air defense grid was burning energy before the real threat even appeared. The second layer targeted Russia's electronic picture. A repeater drone broadcast controlled GPS distortion over eastern Grozny, briefly scrambling navigation feeds inside Rosgvardia vehicles and confusing automated threat classification systems. On the command screens, tracks jumped, slowed, or disappeared entirely. For a region accustomed to predictable patterns, the sudden uncertainty created a gap, a delay in decision-making that Ukrainian planners counted on. The third layer was the low-altitude strike group. These were the real weapons. Compact, terrain-hugging UAVs flying under 50 meters, using the hills and urban clutter to stay below radar. They were launched only when the decoys had fully occupied local defenses. At that moment, the air defense grid was saturated, ammunition stocks were reduced, and operators were sorting through conflicting data. In that environment, even a well-equipped region can be blind. The benefit for Ukraine was simple. A clear corridor opened in front of the strike drones, exactly when they needed it. And as the final decoy tracks faded from the radar screens, the lead UAV crossed the ridge north of Grozny, already locked onto its target. The first hit came quickly. At 6:12 a.m., while most of Grozny's Baksangurov district was just beginning its morning routine, a low-altitude UAV broke through the tree line north of the SeverAkhmat headquarters. It flew at barely 40 meters, using the shadow of an apartment block to stay hidden until the final approach. Security cameras captured the last 3 seconds. A sharp turn, a straight line toward the command wing, and impact. The explosion lifted part of the roof and sent a column of smoke into the sky. Within minutes, residents posted footage showing black plumes rising over the district, before those posts were scrubbed by local authorities. Sirens followed. Roads around the facility were sealed. Rosgvardia units were redirected from routine patrols to the blast zone. The message was immediate. A base the Kremlin considered untouchable had just been struck on home soil. But the operation wasn't finished. While emergency crews converged on Grozny, the second phase was already unfolding further south. A second UAV, this one flying an even lower profile, used a valley route east of the Argon River to approach Shali, a town long considered part of the interior command network for Chechnya's security forces. At 6:58 a.m., it appeared on dashcam footage, traveling barely above the rooftops. Witnesses described hearing a fast mechanical buzz before seeing a flash near a support building associated with SeverAkhmat's logistics section. The detonation was smaller than the Grozny strike, but just as symbolic. It proved the first hit was not an isolated breach. It was one part of a coordinated attack sequence. Russian state media quickly announced that 4 drones were intercepted across Chechnya. But satellite imagery and geolocated videos told a different story. 2 impacts were verified, one in Grozny, one in Shali, both consistent with precision, low-altitude strikes. 2 cities, less than 60 minutes. The message was already written in smoke. Chechen security forces, once used as a rapid response arm of the Kremlin, could no longer assume distance protected them. For Moscow, the timing was its own kind of shock. The Grozny blast and the Shali strike occurred within an hour, close enough to overwhelm local command, far enough apart to force separate responses in 2 different districts. That was no coincidence. By the time Shali's emergency crews secured the site, Chechnya's defenses were no longer dealing with a single attack. They were dealing with the realization that the region had been penetrated twice in less than 60 minutes, a breach of confidence more damaging than any structural loss. And as those 2 smoke columns faded into the morning haze, the wider impact of the operation was just beginning. The first minutes after the blasts exposed cracks that had been invisible in Chechnya's command structure. At SeverAkhmat's headquarters in Grozny, internal radios stalled almost immediately. Routine channels that normally carried constant traffic dropped to static. Officers attempted to relay casualty reports and movement orders, but transmissions overlapped or cut out mid-sentence. For nearly 15 minutes, the command post operated without a reliable picture of what was happening beyond its own perimeter. On the streets surrounding the Byzangarov district, the response turned into gridlock. Armored Rosgvardia trucks, police vehicles, and emergency crews converged on the same access roads. With traffic lights down and no central coordination, intersections clogged until vehicles could no longer move in either direction. Engines idled, doors slammed. Officers stepped out into the roadway, waving contradictory instructions. Across the air defense network, operators struggled to separate real threats from the decoys still drifting on their screens. A Pantsir crew south of Grozny locked onto an object moving slowly at low altitude and fired 2 missiles, only to report moments later that the target had disappeared. Another unit reported 3 tracks moving together, then revising the number to 1, then none. Confusion replaced clarity. In Shali, patrol units were ordered to secure the perimeter of the impact site, but the order reached some teams before others. Several vehicles left their posts early, leaving gaps along the eastern approach road. Others remained in place, unaware that they had been told to move. The delay created a patchwork response, active units scattered across the town, inactive units waiting for instructions that never came. Inside the Regional Operations Center, the screens showed fragments of the real situation, but not the whole. Phone lines lit up. Dispatchers attempted to log reports, but updates arrived faster than they could be processed. Smoke in Grozny, movement in Shali, unidentified contacts on radar, road closures, evacuation calls. The system absorbed everything, but resolved almost nothing. Within 30 minutes, Chechnya's security forces were responding to 2 strikes without a synchronized command structure. Some units moved quickly, others stood by. The region had personnel, equipment, and training. But in these first critical moments, it did not have cohesion. And the breach that began as a pair of UAV impacts now expanded into something larger, a security apparatus reacting without a single, unified picture of the battlefield. By late morning, the implications of the twin strikes were already reshaping Chechnya's security posture. What began as 2 drone impacts quickly turned into a region-wide reassessment of risk. Checkpoints tightened across Grozny and Shali. Patrols that normally moved in predictable loops were pulled back to their bases. Several SeverAkhmat units scheduled to rotate toward OSINT received immediate stand-down orders and were told to remain inside the Republic. The redirection created gaps in Russia's deployment cycle on the Donetsk front. Air defense coverage shifted as well. Satellite imagery later showed a Pantsir battery relocated from Gudermis to Grozny's southern ring, and additional electronic warfare trucks moving along the Terek Valley. Each repositioning strengthened Chechnya's defenses, but thinned protection elsewhere. Information control tightened, yet local footage continued to circulate online. The contrast between official statements and visible emergency responses signaled a new reality to residents. Whatever protection they believed existed around Chechnya had been breached. For Moscow, the strategic problem was immediate. Reinforcing the North Caucasus meant drawing resources away from active combat zones. And for the first time since the start of the war, internal security and frontline commitments were competing for the same pool of forces. By the end of the day, one conclusion was unavoidable. The strikes did not just hit 2 buildings, they forced Russia to stretch its defenses in 2 directions at once. As night settled over the North Caucasus, the fires in Grozny and Shali finally dimmed. But the tension did not. Russian forces tightened their perimeter, commanders reviewed their fault lines, and the sense of vulnerability continued to ripple through the region. 2 smoke columns now hung over Chechnya. The war had come home. Moscow now had its answer, written in black smoke above 2 cities. And this raises the question Russia now has to answer, whether it admits it or not. If 2 small drones can force a full regional lockdown in a single afternoon, what happens when the next strike isn't 2? In the next report, we break down how Ukraine is mapping deeper targets across the Caucasus, and why Moscow's response window is shrinking by the week. Stay with us.